It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this session. It's one that covers issues that are important, challenging, and most important to me at least, deeply interesting. Going beyond GDP to count what counts. I'm sure some of you were here for last year's session on Beyond GDP, which took the form of a debate between Chris Giles of the FT and Diana Coyle from the Bennett School of Public Policy at Cambridge. This year, we're in a position to consider some concrete progress that's been made in counting. The recently published recommendations of the UN High-Level Expert Group on Beyond GDP. But first, I'll introduce myself. I'm Jonathan Price, an advisor to the UK Office for Statistics Regulation. I've been asked to chair this session, not because of my expertise in the topic, which could generously be described as limited, but perhaps reflecting my past engagement with some of the issues as Chief Economist for the Welsh Government. There's a law in Wales, the Future Generations Act, which requires the Welsh Government to establish indicators to monitor progress against a set of 7 well-being goals, covering things like health, equality, and prosperity. Establishing the indicators, and there are 50 of them now, was a lengthy process that drew both on statistical and analytic expertise, but also reflected political choice and judgment. There's a considerable overlap with the indicators recommended by the expert group, but also many differences, reflecting in part specific local concerns and issues, such as in Wales, a concern with the future of the Welsh language. One particular interesting feature was that Welsh ministers were sceptical of measures of job satisfaction. They thought that such measures risked entrenching and embedding a culture of low expectations. It'll be interesting to see if there's pressure for any changes in the indicator set following the recent election results in Wales, where Plaid Cymru became the party of government. Probably not. Plaid Cymru is a centre-left party, quite like the Labour Party in terms of its underlying values, I think. So probably not pressure for a change given that result, but I think it's reasonable to speculate that the most likely alternative outcome, which would have been a government led by reform, would have resulted in some pressure for changes to the indicator set. Well, whenever we gather to discuss the limitations of economic aggregates, there's an unspoken rule that someone eventually will quote Robert F. Kennedy's 68 speech. Since it's become something of a requirement for this topic, I thought I'd take the liberty of getting in first and claiming my £5. Kennedy famously remarked that GDP measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And he makes a persuasive argument. But as we sit here in 2026, looking at the recently released recommendations from the high-level expert group, we can consider the concrete progress that's been made in measuring what makes life worthwhile. And while Kennedy's statement was persuasive, it was perhaps exaggerated. As Chris Giles noted last year, GDP does actually include many things that enable a worthwhile life: food, clean water, energy, shelter, and aspects of health and education. Now, few would deny that these are important aspects of well-being, even if they fall short of the full picture. The trouble we face as statisticians, analysts, and policymakers is that once we move beyond these basics, what really matters becomes both deeply contested and, of course, difficult to measure. Take equality, for example. People, political parties, and even different governments can disagree fundamentally on the weight we should give to equality, or whether equality of outcome should even be a primary metric of success at all. Consider Sen's famous work on the conflicting aspects of justice. He illustrated this with the example of 3 children quarrelling over a flute, one who knows how to play it, one who is so poor she has no other toys, and one who actually made the flute. Each has a legitimate claim based on 3 different frameworks for assessing whether outcomes are just: equity, entitlement, and utility, perhaps better term need in some contexts. I think most of us will feel some pull from each of these frameworks, perhaps to a varying extent depending on context. Our approach to economic equality will reflect in part these tensions and the weights we give to different frameworks. People and societies can reasonably disagree about where the balance lies. These conceptual challenges are, of course, compounded by major challenges of measurement and valuation. Consider accounting for perhaps the most important externality, carbon emissions. Economic valuations of the social cost of carbon vary by at least an order of magnitude, reflecting uncertainties about the physical effects, the methods chosen to assess costs, choices, and the weight to be given to reducing small but very bad risks. Also, there are obvious questions of intergenerational equity. When we turn to measures of subjective well-being, we hit old chestnuts raised by philosophers, and which may still seem to remain stubbornly relevant, though I think Richard may argue they've been resolved. But would I choose to take a happiness drug, even if I suspected it would reduce my levels of motivation and drive? If we rely solely on how people feel, we run into the problems of the informed versus the happy. What if knowing the truth about a crisis, say the long-term reality of climate change or structural debt makes you less happy? Does that mean the progress of a nation has declined simply because its citizens are more informed and therefore more anxious? Furthermore, we have to deal with technical headaches like scale norming and stretching. If your life improves but your expectations rise even faster, your reported well-being might stay flat. Is this the hedonic treadmill or a measurement problem? As national statistical organisations, how do we calibrate a standard meter for human emotion over time? In summary then, we have three main types of approach. First, GDP and associated national accounts-based measures, which seem to remain our most robust, albeit narrow tools, and which are of course capable of expansion to become somewhat more comprehensive measures. Second, baskets of indicators that attempt to cover the wide variety of aspects of the good life, such as the Welsh example I mentioned earlier, and as we shall shortly hear, the authoritative recommendations of the UN expert group. Third, we have subjective well-being indicators, which capture lived experience and which may be seen as either the main end of policy or as one component in a basket. And I know Richard will address that question. In addition, there seems to be an ever-growing list of other options and measures being created. For example, some very interesting recent work using trends in the value of a statistical life. This all makes the discussion highly complex, with divergence in measured outcomes and trends depending on the choices made. It makes the drawing of conclusions on the extent to which countries are progressing challenging. The core question of this session then is, what's the proper role for national statistical institutes in this complex environment? How do we balance the depth required for a robust framework with the simplicity required for a headline that the public can understand? How do we respond to the measurement challenges and the value-laden nature of the choices that have to be made? In 2024, the UN Pact for the Future set the expert group the task of taking forward the approach pioneered by Stiglitz, the aforementioned Sen and Fitoussi. Today, we can see the progress they've made in creating a framework to sit alongside the system of national accounts to guide and support NSIs in their task. To help us navigate these choppy waters, we've got a Premier League cast, actually probably a Championship League cast, who've been at the coalface of these issues for many years. First, we've got Martine Durand, a member of the UN High-Level Expert Group and former chief statistician at the OECD. Martine will set out the group's core recommendations and the vision for an integrated universal framework. Then we will hear from Lord Richard Layard, author of Wellbeing, Science and Policy. Rich has been a tireless advocate for the science of happiness and will offer his perspective on why subjective well-being must remain central. Then we have third, Sarah Davidson, Chief Executive of Carnegie UK. Sarah brings the perspective of civil society and will discuss the Life in the UK Index and how we bridge the gap between statistics and community reality. Finally, Richard Hayes, Deputy Director for Wellbeing Statistics at the ONS and co-chair of the UN Expert Group. Richard will give us his views from the engine room on how the UK and other statistical systems should react to these international developments. Actually, Richard is the ONS's expert on all this, and his participation as a speaker is probably the real reason I'm chairing the session, rather than my experience in Wales, which I just described. Following these presentations, we'll have a panel discussion based around questions and answers from the floor, and we'll take your questions and have a discussion around them in the last half an hour or so of the session. So there we are. I'm going to hand over now to Martine to take us through the recommendations of the
While the presentation is being uploaded, I want to thank you, Jonathan and Richard, for inviting me, and Paul Schreier, who worked with me at the OECD, or I worked with him at the OECD, and I'm very pleased to be here today to present to you the report that was published on the 7th of May, a report by the UN High-Level Group on Beyond GDP. So the title of this book, or the report, is Counting What Counts. It looks like we are trying to find new ways to say the same thing. I have the feeling that I've been in this field for now a number of years, and it's measuring what counts, counting what we valuing what we measure, and so on and so forth. But here it is now a new title, which is Counting What Counts. So, and the subtitle is a compass of progress for people and the planet. So what I'd like to do today is to spend a little bit of time to present to you this report, and of course I'll be very happy to answer any questions at the end. At the outset, So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the context, why this came about. You already mentioned the Pact for the Future, Jonathan, and the mandate we received from the UN Secretary General. Then I'll give a very brief overview of the report, and I'll spend a little bit of time on the recommendation and next steps, because essentially you have to realize that we were given this task to produce this report in about 9 months' time. So, of course, in 9 months, there's so much you can achieve. So, in the recommendations, you will find a lot of things that are for the next steps, as part of the next steps, what's for the future. So, if I move on, I can't move this presentation. Sorry, the clicker does, here, context and mandate. Sorry, now I'm going too fast. So, as per the Pact for the Future, because it was in response for this very important document that was agreed by all UN member countries, this UN Secretary General established a high-level expert group in May 2025 following this mandate. He said the group includes 14 included, because it's now finished its task, 14 members from really diverse academic and policy backgrounds. So there were policy makers, there were also academics, statisticians, representatives from NGOs are part of the group. Importantly, our mandate was to develop a limited set of universally applicable country-owned indicators reflecting the multidimensional nature of sustainable development. Despite all the work that was carried out before, this is quite an ambitious agenda for something that lasted only 9 months. Of course, what was also in the mandate was that we ought to build on existing frameworks, recognizing all the work that had been done previously. In particular, the framework developed for the SDGs, because countries had approved the SDGs, and a lot of work had been done in developing a whole range of indicators for the SDGs. The Stiglitz-Fitoussi report that was published in 2009, and it's ensuing high-level expert group that followed 10 years later on. Then NGO and academic work and national initiatives. But we were also asked to introduce new thinking where necessary. So here are the pictures of the high-level, the members of the high-level group on Beyond GDP. The group was co-chaired by 2 eminent professors, Kaushik Basu, Professor Kaushik Basu, a professor in development economics from Cornell University, who also was the chief economist at the World Bank, and Nora Lustig, who is a professor who has also participated in the follow-up to the Stiglitz Commission and is a professor at Tulane University in the US, having worked a lot on inequalities. And you can see the rest of the members, and you can see that there were some academics, some statisticians, and other prominent people in the group, including, of course, Nobel Prize Joe Stiglitz. What was the approach that was followed by the group? So we recognized at the outset, in fact, we were asked to recognize, but we did recognize as well, that there was an urgent need to move beyond GDP. In fact, this is, I mean, to some extent, it's a little bit of a, I mean, it's interesting that the urgency was set up so high on the mandate, because it's something that many of you will remember. We've been working on that for more than 15 years or more. But there's now apparently more of an urgency among member countries recognizing the Pact for the Future in the face of COVID, of course, of the climate crisis and the rising inequalities. And so limitations of GDP have been known for decades, but there are really the current dissonance between what GDP measures and what people value seems to be even higher on the agenda, requiring urgent action. I should say at the outset that it was never the purpose of this group to throw GDP out. So, okay, GDP was recognized as remaining a very important yardstick and a very important measure of economic production, and very useful for policy making as well, in particular macro policy. But the aim was really to reduce the overall reliance on GDP for purposes where, in a sense, it was not meant to it was not meant to be, and in particular setting up long-term priorities, measuring overall progress, societal progress, but also the whole issue of development, assessing development and financing for development, where GDP per capita is essentially the yardstick to decide whether developing countries should receive development aid assistance. So the idea was to come up with a new compass with a broader set of measures to guide policy and decision making, again, building on the many important initiatives that had been taken previously. For that, we also were asked, and we did, have a wide range of consultations. We had close to 20 meetings with experts, with civil society organizations, various stakeholders. We also had an online consultation following the publication of an interim report. And overall, we reached over 6,000 organizations and UN regional commissions, some governments, but also international organizations. So we spent a lot of time consulting, actually, to understand what people wanted, although we didn't ask directly to people in different countries. We didn't have the time. So the final point is that this idea is that it's the first time that the UN is actually setting up an agenda to go beyond GDP and to set up new norms, in a sense, at the global level. So the approach of the group was to try to get a first global blueprint to set up norms to move beyond GDP. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because despite the fact that there are still a lot of frameworks, there's no convergence. Nothing has been converging so far. So the approach of the high-level group was we set up as an objective of our sort of measure of progress the fact that we were going for something that we aimed at measuring equitable, inclusive, and sustainable well-being. And we thought that that was the best way to bring convergence among the different initiatives. Because if you look at the literature and academics that we consulted as well, you see that they've really been converging towards this notion of equitable, inclusive, and sustainable well-being. In particular, as it was in the Stiglitz-Fitoussi Commission in 2009, but also now as it has been developed throughout the years. And the point is to try to institutionalize this convergence at global level through the UN. So the report centerpiece is actually a conceptual framework to go beyond GDP and a dashboard that puts people and the planet at the center, which is one of the novelty, I would say, of the frameworks, where we really have this dual approach of the well-being of people is dependent on the well-being of the planet and vice versa. And so we have to look at the two together. Then we also proposed we sought to propose advances in measurement in frontier areas, and I think we'll hear more from that from Richard, where capacities allow, because we couldn't, of course, do everything. And we provided a roadmap to do that. And in the end, also propose some actionable recommendations to influence decision-making. So those are the goals that we set for ourselves, if you wish, over those 9 months. So let me now move on to the overview of the report. What's in the report, very briefly. So the key elements of the report, as I said, is a conceptual framework, an indicator dashboard with a discussion on whether or not, on top of the dashboard, we should also propose a headline aggregate indicator. Again, not to replace GDP, but along with GDP, to complement GDP. Then we propose a data and statistical agenda to implement the dashboard indicators with a tier approach, or what's available now, what can be available. We have the methodological standards, but we're not there yet, and the third tier of what would need to be done in the future. And then the report ends with recommendations. So let me try to get you this conceptual framework. So the conceptual framework, again, the idea is to measure inclusive, equitable well-being and sustainable well-being. So the main characteristics of this framework are the following. It puts, as I said, in green in the middle, people and the planet together, interlinked, intertwined. And that's organized under this principle of equitable and inclusive and sustainable well-being. But where it has an interesting feature compared to some other frameworks is that it doesn't just look at individual well-being, not just individual conditions, but it takes for granted that well-being is actually not just individual, but it is also collective. And a society cannot thrive just by aggregating individuals' well-being. So it goes for individuals, for communities, for countries, but even at the global level, because what happens in one country has effect on the well-being of people in another country. And so you need to take those global interactions as well. So it expands the scope, if you wish, going beyond the individual to the communities, the countries, and the global community, globally. Now, it looks at well-being today and well-being for the future generations. So it's today and tomorrow. So it looks at current well-being and how we can ensure the sustainability of well-being, so to leave open the options for future generations, in particular safeguarding the key forms of capital. One new element in this respect is that we introduced institutional capital among the sets of different capitals. Typically, other frameworks have produced natural, social, human, and natural capital, but omit institutional capital. There were members of the group that were really adamant to say that if you don't have the right institutional capital, a country cannot thrive, and individual cannot thrive. And importantly, and I should have started by that perhaps, is that the whole framework is grounded on foundational principles, and that's also new, and that's based on the UN Charter, where you cannot have well-being of people or of communities or others if you don't have some foundational principles, which are peace, human rights, and planetary boundaries. So in a sense, these are really foundations that are added to typical other frameworks. Under current well-being, you will recognize, I will come to that a little bit later, some very familiar elements and dimensions of current well-being. Now, two other things that are perhaps new there is in this framework is that we also talk about the cross-country spillovers, which are not represented in the framework because we didn't have the time to actually elaborate too much on that. But we really insisted that we should also have in the dashboard those country spillovers, and indeed in the indicators later on. And finally, all this can only happen if you have the right enablers, which again we didn't elaborate on, such as good governance, good technological frameworks, and so on. So here is the conceptual framework that we developed, and we started then from that going through measurement. So for measurement, we established a dashboard. So as you will see, when the purple, the orange and green, and then the dark red are reflected in the dashboard. And so under the current well-being, we have material conditions and work, health, education, security, subjective well-being, social cohesion, quality of institutions, and environmental quality. And under equity and inclusion, you will see that there's wealth inequality, income inequality, and other. I mean, I'll let you look at it. I'm going to go through it, but poverty. So there's also questions and dimensions dealing with deprivation, and so poverty and even the multidimensional poverty deprivation. And under sustainability, as I mentioned, the 5 types of capital, and the foundational principles. So under these different elements, we then looked at indicators, how we could populate this dashboard. So the dashboard was populated through 31 indicators. Remember that the mandate was, in the mandate we were asked actually to have a limited number of indicators. And in fact, in the mandate, if you read it carefully, it was saying no more than 20. But it was hard to find just 20, so we went through for 31, knowing that if we added a few indicators for things that we have not covered yet, it would be a little bit more. But importantly, 17 of those indicators are drawn from the SDG indicator framework, and that came very, very strongly from the consultation process. Why? Because countries, and particularly national statistical offices, have invested a lot in developing indicators for the SDGs. And they were saying, are you going to come up with, again, a new task for us to develop new indicators again? So please, if possible, use the SDG indicators. And we tried hard to populate the dashboard with existing SDG indicators. So 17 of them are drawn from the SDG indicator framework, which also was found very useful to actually make the dashboard immediately usable, because if the indicators have already been collected and calculated through the SDGs, then they can also be used for this new dashboard. So again, that was a key priority for member countries. The rest of the indicators followed the same logic as the SDGs. They were based on well-established criteria such as quality, availability, relevance, etc. So they're spread across the 4 fundamental components: the yellow, the purple, the orange, the green, and the red, dark red. And so 5 are for foundational principles, 14 for current well-being, 6 for equity and inclusion, and 6 for sustainability and resilience. As I said, the dashboard is ready for use, and we provided a tier system to ensure that there is a roadmap to developing the dashboard. Nevertheless, there are still some very important methodological gaps for Tier 3 indicators in particular that we highlighted, including in the foundational principles dealing with human rights and planetary boundaries. Under current well-being, we also pointed to social cohesion indicators, mental health, in the whole area of digital linked to the digital transformations and the implications for well-being, and subjective measures that are not currently, some exist, but not really well-founded methodologically within national statistical offices, but more in other type of sources and surveys. Under the sustainability and resilience, there is also a need to improve on the measurement of capitals, in particular human, social, institutional capital, but still on natural capital as well. Then I want to spend 2 minutes talking to you about this idea of having an aggregate headline indicators. Once you have the 31 indicators, can you not calculate a single headline indicators, or perhaps 1 or 2 indicators, one for current well-being and one for sustainability? Because in terms of communication, and in terms of competition with GDP, that may be easier to speak to people. Also, because for policymakers, having one number to refer to might be an easier task than looking at 31 indicators. We had long discussions among members, some arguing that it was very important to keep to the dashboard because for policy action, you want to act on the different aspects of what makes well-being. Others saying that it's mind-boggling for policymakers and they need one number. We had lots of experts coming, presenting their views on that, but we couldn't reach, within the time frame, we couldn't reach an agreement on the weighting system. How do you go about weighting indicators, even if it's current well-being and sustainability? And we have a discussion in the report about the choice of weights. You can have simple weights like the HDI, you put equal weights to everything, and this is a sort of statistical methods, but you can also have different types of weight where you based on preferences, on values, and there that requires, we think, more work, and so that's what we will be recommending in the end, that further work should be done, but we did not come up with a proposal for a headline indicator, although we think that it would be a good complement to the dashboard. And the other area where there is a methodology gap is on cross-country spillovers, as I said earlier. So let me finish with the recommendations and next steps. So the recommendations, we decided to split them up into the stakeholders that are to actually, if we want to implement this agenda, there are various stakeholders that should be part of this agenda. Governments, international organizations, the international statistical community and national statistical community, but also other stakeholders such as, of course, academia, civil society, private sector, and the media. And we insist that all of them should move in tandem rather than having just government or just the statistical community. In fact, we've seen that coming from the statistical community, we've seen that the statistical community has done huge amount of work already in this field, but it has not been picked up by governments, okay? Or not by international organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, and financing institutions. So there is a gap. If there is this gap between what different stakeholders do, then we won't get there. So here, I won't go through that. Those are the different roles of the key stakeholders. So for governments, we really insist that they need to develop dashboards in their own country, and they should publish this every year, starting in 2027. And but importantly, like is done actually in Wales, and it was in the UK and in other countries, New Zealand at the time. It has to be integrated in the budgetary process so that it really becomes part of the policy decision making. But governments should also, of course, fund national statistical offices to carry out the statistical work. For international organizations, they should lead the global coordination, in particular the UN, and support countries, in particular developing countries. Remember, this is not an agenda for developed countries. It has to be universal and country-owned. So there's a lot of work for developing countries, and the UN has to be present here together with the World Bank and IMF and so on. And the UN and the international organizations should be also monitor global progress overall. Now let me spend a little bit more time on the statistical community, because we believe that there's a need for strengthened coordination through the UN Statistical Commission to ensure the validity, credibility, and consistency of the Beyond GDP measures, that they should work on these tier 3 indicators, in particular set up new groups to work on this, work also with researchers on something that some scholars have criticized the high-level group for not having considered enough, which is the wealth, comprehensive wealth accounting, where we did consider it, but we decided not to propose it because it would take too long, and it's not ripe, and it's perhaps not for the statistical community alone, but more for research together with statistical community to continue to work on this. And so we proposed establishing scientific committees to also design aggregate headline indicators and also on cross-border impact. So the Statistical Commission will have a big agenda ahead of it if it takes this report forward. And then the civil society, of course, is very important to have public engagement through forums, town halls, dialogue on national progress, also for advocacy and influencing the public discourse, encourage the media to report on well-being, but also the academic community to help advancing the research and innovation in methodology and support the global cooperation. So with this, I want to finish with the next steps. The Secretary General, when the report was delivered to him, said that the report is a landmark step in correcting a long-standing blind spot in measuring progress. The over-reliance on GDP, it was designed to be a narrow metric of economic output, yet became one of the most consequential numbers for international policy, something its architects never intended. The report makes concrete recommendations for complementary indicators that measure what matters most to people and planet. So he was quite happy, in a sense, with the report. But I just would like to say that in the next steps, the day we launched the report, immediately an intergovernmental process started, coordinated by Spain and Guyana. And the countries received the report quite well and were very keen to actually see how to implement it, but that's going to be a long process because it's a UN process. I shouldn't say that, but I say it anyway. And so they are going to set up a roadmap for implementation of the recommendations, and a few countries have already lined up to actually pilot the conceptual framework and the dashboard. And so we're very happy that they will be leading the way in that direction. So I thank you. If you want to know more about the indicators, they are in the presentation that will be made available, I suppose, at the end of this conference. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Martine. Can I invite Lord Richard Layard to reflect on the progress that's been made and offer his views?
Well, thank you so much for asking me. This is actually very nostalgic for me because I remember so well, goodness, how many years ago is it?
A long time.
12 years at least.
Yes.
Martine being the pioneer of well-being measurement at the OECD. And
2011.
That was such amazing progress that she made at that time. So I think it's great that we have a UN report which, in a sense, builds on the OECD approach, the house life approach, produces a slightly different list. It still hasn't got to the point of the aggregate, solving the problem of the aggregate. So that's the issue that I really want to talk about, because the problem with the dashboard approach is we say we want to be policy relevant, but if you've got a whole list of outcomes and you don't know which is more valuable than which, and you've got two policies, and one is better on one outcome and the other is better on another outcome, how do you choose between them? So this is a problem which has always faced policymakers. It's why cost-benefit analysis was invented, to try and have a single outcome against which everything should be measured. The outcome, as we know, was not adequate. I mean, the outcome was originally more or less GDP, then had bits added onto it that could be monetized easily. But the outcome was limited, and that's the origin, if you like, of the Beyond GDP movement, that we've got to get beyond the old single outcome. But I maintain that we will only succeed in doing that if we have another, better single outcome. And that's the case that I want to make for you. I think it's a logical case that if you really want to influence policy, you've got to have a single criterion against which everything can be evaluated. I think it's also a political point. If you want to displace from the public mentality one indicator, you're much more likely to succeed if you offer another one, rather than something very complicated. People are currently fixated on one, and I think we should offer them a better alternative. Now, what should it be? So the way I go about this, somewhat the way Aristotle went at it, and I think it's a very good way of reasoning. We can say there are all these goods, 31, we've just had all these goods. And then you can ask, why are they good? So, why is wealth good? Well, people feel bad if they're poor. Why is health good? People feel bad if they're sick. Freedom, they feel bad if they're in prison, etc. Then you come to subjective well-being, how people feel. Why does that matter? You can't give any reason. I mean, it's obvious. That is so central to the way in which humans experience their lives, that is the natural concept of the overarching good. So that is the outcome, and then you have to think of wealth, health, freedom, etc., as inputs into that outcome. And I think that this report is sort of struggling between the concept of that somehow well-being must be sort of an overarching concept, but actually you're left with all the separate goods. So what should be the overarching outcome? Well, many of us favour life satisfaction. This is 0 to 10. Overall, how satisfied are you with your life these days? Not at all. 10 completely. We know there's a lot of information content in this measure. For example, it's the best predictor both in national elections in Europe and in US presidential elections. You find that be the best predictor of whether the government gets re-elected. It's about as good a predictor of how long you'll live as a medical examination. It has a strong impact on productivity, quitting, and many other things. So we know there's information content in it. We know it's not perfect, but nothing is perfect. And of course, when you start adding across groups, some of the imperfection is washed away. So I would say, let us go for life satisfaction as the overarching good. And if you don't do this, this is what the British government or the British Treasury has done, in the sense that the Green Book says that when departments are asking for money or regulations, they should measure the outcome in terms of, number one, if it's already financial money, but if it's not, for all non-financial outcomes, which are, as we know in our own lives, a huge chunk of it, it should be measured in terms of impact on life satisfaction, and then we can use what we know about the marginal utility of income to monetize the life satisfaction and add it back to the income outcomes. But the implicit thing in that is, of course, that the life satisfaction is the measure of utility. So we've moved beyond GDP to what? We moved to life satisfaction. That is, I think, where you land if you want to move beyond GDP. So that's what I was hoping the group might say, and it hasn't said it, but it has discussed this question of whether there should be an aggregate index. So let me move on to that issue. We've actually also, some of you who follow journals might possibly look at Nature Human Behavior. We've had a controversy with the Harvard Global Flourishing Group on this that's still ongoing in that journal. But what is the what is the problem with an index? Obviously, is where the weights come from, as Martine said. One way of getting the rates, of course, is to take some single outcome, life satisfaction, regress all these different things, regress it on all these different things, and take the weights that come out of that. And I think that would be a very good step forward. And I hope that future work of other UN statistical commissions, which are still ongoing, would consider that. But there's still a problem with that. I mean, if you're implicitly thinking that the thing, let's say life satisfaction, that you got that provided the weights is the overarching good, why measure an index using those weights rather than just the thing itself? So I do feel the logic of this will eventually come through. That the logic of it is we will have to end up with a single indicator. But I think an index would also be a very, very useful step forward as the next progression at the UN level. So just a word more on the single index, because inclusion is one of the criteria that you mentioned. And I take it that inclusion essentially means that we're not just interested in the mean of this outcome, say life satisfaction. We're also interested in its distribution, and we want the distribution to be narrow. And in particular, we don't want large numbers of people to fall below some level. So we shouldn't just be looking at means. We should be looking at, for example, the percentage below 5 or whatever level was thought to be the equivalent to a poverty level in terms of well-being. So what does this mean for statistical agencies? I mean, I think that where the UK is at is a very good place, in the sense that though we still talk about well-being as a dashboard, we do put the ONS 4 at the top. And we do put at the top of the 4 life satisfaction. And that gives us a sort of guiding star, which, as I say, the Treasury have taken as their own guiding star. So we're in quite a good place to carry this forward, both in terms of the way we're measuring national well-being. Obviously, I wish the press would report the life satisfaction measures every quarter, which I think are in the press release with GDP, but don't get reported. Somehow we've got to do that, and I think it would be helpful if the ONS could pick on one, because having 4 means that none of them get reported. If you picked on one, there's a good chance it would get reported. So we're in a good place, and we, I think, can make important contributions to the next steps. But if I could just end with my main point is that there are 2 ways of thinking about this whole thing. The way in which the group that we're in controversy with at Harvard think is that there are a whole set of constituents of well-being. Well-being consists of these 31 things, of which subjective well-being is one. The other way of thinking is that well-being consists of subjective well-being, and all these other things are very important because they are the main inputs into it. And that's the point of view that I hope will ultimately prevail. Thanks.
With thanks to Lord Layard, I'm now going to hand over to Sarah Davidson to talk about the Carnegie approach.
So thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm delighted to be here today. Carnegie UK was given the mandate and mission to progress the well-being of the people of the UK and Ireland as long ago as 1913 by our founder, Andrew Carnegie. And nowadays we are an endowed public policy foundation, and our strategic aim is to put well-being at the heart of decision-making. And we've worked closely over the years with the ONS, with governments in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, at different tiers of local governance in England to help people identify and implement effective use of well-being measures. So this conversation is right up our street. We've been keeping an eye over the last few years on the developing conversation at the UN, and I'm particularly grateful to Richard for helping us to parse that from a bit of a distance. And I've really enjoyed reading the final report, not least for the emphasis that it places on the role of civic society within that broader ecosystem for change, which very much reflects our own experience of working with governments and other actors. And I like that mandate to participate in interpreting and debating the use of measures, and of course ultimately holding policymakers to account, which is a key role for civic society. So I'm going to use the time that's been allotted to me today to do two things, which I hope are particularly reflective of our role. The first is to describe the contribution that Carnegie UK has been making over recent years to try and advance the debate about what it means to redefine progress, and critically what our index has taught us, which I hope will be useful for thinking about the next steps following the UN report. And secondly, as indeed Jonathan already began to do, to remind delegates about the multiplicity of current examples of measuring well-being just within the UK, and what our research at Carnegie UK indicates needs to happen next in order to maximise the value of these. So we first started working on this concept of putting well-being at the heart of government decision-making in the immediate aftermath of the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report in 2009. And since then, as I say, we've supported various governments to take a broader view of what societal progress actually means. And in doing so, to help them think about how to balance the different domains of social, economic, environmental, and what we call democratic well-being, which I think is very similar to what the expert group is getting at when it talks about institutional strength. And we've really wanted to help people think about how to use those measures and their understanding of how things are now to influence their decision-making and their resource allocation, and in particular their long-term planning. And we very quickly came to the view in that work that measurement was critical to this process. And our hypothesis was that if collective well-being were to become a key measure of progress, that would inform public debate, inform governmental decision-making, and that would in turn determine where resources go and therefore what gets done. Back in 2019, so after we'd been at that work for about a decade, we first began to experiment with a wellbeing index inspired by the Canadian Index of Wellbeing and the Oxford Humankind Index. We wanted to see, picking up from where Richard's been, we wanted to see whether or not it was possible to create that single number that could answer the question of how life is now and also address this distorting dominance of GDP with which we're all familiar. Again, not about supplanting or replacing, but about giving something else to think about what really matters. And the Life in the UK Index was the output of that process of experimentation. Now, just give me half a second. My presentation is just shut on me. Oh. Sorry, give me a moment. Yeah. 2 seconds. I'm just going to get my other bit of kit and I shall be straight back. It's just over here. Perils of technology rather than relying on good old Pen and paper, exactly. Richard's showing us all the way. Give me one moment. Right, here we are. I'm being confounded by all technology. Which one we just...
Okay, I think our technology is failing to simulate it. I just told the range big clicker doesn't always go that far.
Oh, right. You want to have a go? I've only got a small number, so if you could move them on for me, that would be really helpful. That's great. I'll just ask you to move them on. I'll do that. So, thank you for bearing with me. So the Life in the UK Index was the product of several years of experimentation and refinement, and it was designed to measure the collective well-being of the people of the UK. And it was good to hear Martine refer to the importance of collective well-being as opposed to simply the aggregate of individual well-being. It's the largest independent measure of collective well-being in the UK, and it's the only well-being index that covers Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. So our goal in doing this was to create an index that would be timely, so we issue the data within 6 months of collection. Comprehensive, covering all domains of well-being, and I'll say a bit more about those in a moment. Robust, so both for the individual indicators and also for the index methodology. Relevant, so that people across the UK would see it as being relevant to their lives, but also relevant to policy making, and useful. So able to be used by all those who are interested in improving lives in the UK. And critically, and I see that Ed Humphreys is in the audience here, it was important to us to comply with the UK Code of Practice in Statistics. Our trustees at Carnegie UK early on made a commitment to run with this till at least 2030, so to give a really decent time series of data. We have a sample size of around 7,000 each year. The 26-question survey of mainly objective measures is run by Ipsos on their random probability knowledge panel, and we get good survey sizes, which means that we can publish an index for each of England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and we have a booster applied to capture the experience of minority ethnic groups. Can I have the next slide, please? So getting to the data, what does Life in the UK give us? It gives us that single score for collective well-being that shows whether we are living better or worse over time. It gives a score for each of the 4 domains of well-being, social, economic, environmental, and democratic. It gives both collective well-being and domain scores for the UK as a whole, Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and each of the English regions. And it gives us collective well-being and domain scores for the different demographic groups. So you'll see that using the terminology of the expert group, our focus is on current well-being, but we analyse and present the data in ways that tell a story about inequalities, both between different groups of people and between different places. Very conscious of the technical debate within the expert group and the arguments for and against different approaches to aggregate indicators. I think it's important to stress that our single score for collective well-being is a simple average of the 4 domain scores. And yes, we did opt for a composite score while recognising all the challenges involved in that, because we wanted to see whether we could create this single number, this single measure, which provided a complement to GDP while showing the benefits of that single indicator for communication and debate. And we wanted to demonstrate that it was possible to do that in a robust way and to show that you could tell a compelling story about how the 2 numbers of GDP and collective well-being might converge and diverge over time. And you can see here, I'm not going to go into the data because I don't think that's really the conversation for today, but you can see that the most recent collective wellbeing score for the UK was 62 out of a possible 100, and these are the 2025 results. So we go into the field next week for 2026, and we'll publish the next index this autumn. So a couple of things we've learned which I think are relevant to this debate from the years that we've now been publishing the Life in the UK index. So interestingly, in practice, people have turned out to be a bit less interested in and engaged by the single number than I think we had anticipated. That's possibly because we need more of a time series to really tell that story, but it's also because it's probably unrealistic to anticipate significant differences in the number year by year, so the story is maybe not that interesting. The strongest interest that we've had from policymakers and from the media has been in some of the demographic insights, and in particular where this highlights significantly different experiences for different groups and places. We've discovered that policymakers and politicians and the media are actually genuinely interested in the story that we can tell about well-being in the UK. So since we first published, the index has been used as evidence and to prompt debate in the House of Lords, in the Chamber of the Scottish Parliament, in the Northern Irish Assembly, and the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales recently cited Life in the UK evidence in his independent report, while the recommendations relevant to Scotland were relevant in the development of wellbeing legislation in the last Parliament in Scotland. And of course, it's something about our political impartiality and objectivity that allows us to hold a space for telling that story that's maybe a slightly different space from the one that the statistical authorities are able to hold. And finally, again, picking up from one of the points in the expert report, we've been able to experiment a bit with bringing other sources of data into the conversation to complement the survey results. And we've had a particular interest in how you capture some of the voices of those furthest from traditional political power. And we worked during the development of the index with the UK Poverty Truth Network and have met over recent years with members of that network to talk to them about what economic well-being and democratic well-being in particular mean for them. And we're really interested in the coming years to think about how you go on doing some of that. I want to be clear that our intention, our objective for this programme is not to persuade the governments of the UK to adopt Life in the UK as their index. What we want to do is to show that this can be done, and that if you select indicators that people recognise as meaningful and use them to tell a compelling story and build them into policy making, it can make a difference. So for us, success would be all the governments of the UK developing, refining and making good use of a set of wellbeing indicators, ideally as one component of an overall framework for wellbeing policy governance. If I could have the next slide. Sorry, could you go back one? I think that's skipped on. Yeah. And so the good news on that front, up to a point, which I'll come to in a moment, is that there's an awful lot of wellbeing measurement about at the moment in the UK. And maybe we slightly take that for granted, but we should remember there have been huge developments in recent years in all parts of the UK. Not only the ONS dashboard, but long-term population outcomes and associated indicator sets being used in Northern Ireland, in Wales, in Scotland, and at different levels of local authority governance in England. On the left-hand side there is thinking that we've recently published at Carnegie UK on what it would look like to move along or up a maturity curve in the use of these policy guidance mechanisms. And unsurprisingly, an awful lot of what we say there resonates with the recommendations of the expert group about how you really embed these into existing governmental systems. Next slide, please. For me, one of the real strengths of the expert report is the fact that it doesn't shy away from the challenges of implementation in the real world. Because of course it doesn't matter one jot how good your indicator set is if nobody pays any attention to it. We've been working this year to support a community of practice for officials with responsibility in different places in the UK for embedding wellbeing practice in local and national governments. And I've got at least one, if not two, members of the community of practice in the room today, which is great. And we've done some deeper research dives as well this year into how wellbeing data is being used to drive policy decision-making in Wales and in Scotland. And across what's therefore quite a diverse community of policy practitioners and different operating contexts, we found remarkable consistency in the challenges that they are grappling with. So just one or two that stood out. A real proliferation of strategies, of data sets, of performance targets with no meaningful connection to the supposedly overarching well-being outcomes and indicators. A lack of confidence in knowing how to use and talk about data which are designed to measure long-term whole population outcomes. Siloed accountability mechanisms and incentives which emphasize attribution over contribution, and ditto for budget setting processes and relevant related financial accountabilities. The familiar political narrative which emphasizes short-term inputs and outputs over long-term investment, including in preventative activities, and well-being regarded internally by civil servants as just another thing that governments do, as opposed to being the guiding principle for policy governance. And of course, that itself speaks to inconsistent and weak political and executive leadership. So of course there are exceptions to those broad brush comments, and there's some really good examples of attempts to break down silos, to experiment with different approaches of budgeting, to do cross-sector leadership development, but we're still not seeing the transformation at scale that I think we all want. So all of that's to say that I strongly endorse the expert panel's observations on the critical importance of institutionalizing the measurement of well-being within national policymaking processes, cost-benefit analysis, budget approval processes, and accountability frameworks. So as I've crudely summarised on the final slide there, the data needs to be made meaningful, relevant, and visible. And the discussion about what to count, I think, has probably taken us about as far as it can. And the challenge now is to make it count. Just very quickly on the final slide, if you are interested in the, so just one more slide. If you're interested in mining the data, the full Life in UK data is on our website, including the full technical methodology for those of you who are interested in that. And the programme lead for Life in UK is in the audience as well, and I'm sure happy to discuss it afterwards. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I'm just going to hand over to Richard to reflect on the implications for national statistics, and then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. But Richard first.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to look at this question from two angles: what the ONS is doing domestically and how we're participating with the international statistics community to think about the response to counting what counts. And I was going to start by describing the National Wellbeing Dashboard, but I probably will start by saying we don't produce a single index like Carnegie, and that's for no sort of ideological opposition. I think we very much see that there is a real debate there, and we're looking to participate and support on that debate to identify the best ways to tackle that question. So, for example, we're represented on Carnegie's advisory group, who've been thinking through some of those complex questions. And I want to also particularly shout out the ESCoE discussion paper series, where there's a series of papers on this topic, composite indices, which are well worth looking at if you're interested in this field. In terms of where the UK's starting position, therefore, is we have an annual 60-measure national wellbeing dashboard, which you will immediately spot is quite a bit larger than the 31 metrics that Martine has just discussed, which we have historically produced quarterly, and we found that that really wasn't helping us as a communication tool, mainly because different data became available at different time periods. And you couldn't really tell a story that at any point in time you could cleanly say life had got better or life had got worse, even if all the metrics that changed in that quarter went in one direction. You had so many other data points that were going to come available later that you were always sort of lagging behind with the narrative. So we currently have moved to a model of having 7 proxy indicators or headline indicators, which we publish quarterly, which are available on a quarterly basis, and which are not a full explanation of well-being in the UK, but are very much there to help people understand what's happening, what's changing on a timely basis before we reach the annual dashboard, which we'll be releasing in a few weeks' time. The 7 proxy indicators that we currently use are GDP per head to measure material well-being. There are, of course, many other metrics, but if you want to have a Beyond GDP debate, it's always useful to start with GDP as a foundation. We use self-reported health to measure the physical health of the nation. We look at numbers around not in education, employment and training for an education perspective. But we also look at trust in others to understand how communities are operating, trust in government, which is important from understanding how people are relating to government and governance around them. We use quarterly greenhouse gases per head to give us an environmental perspective. That measure is shortly going to be concluded, so we're looking at how to replace that. And of course, greenhouse gas emissions are only one aspect of a very much larger and complex field. But we recognise that these are proxies in the same way that GDP per head doesn't tell you all the stories about material well-being. And finally, and not least, as Richard, I'm sure, will be pleased to hear, is life satisfaction, to give us a view of subjective well-being, which we release on a quarterly basis. Now, putting all of these together, we can therefore look at the metrics in Counting What Counts and think about how these compare and line up with what Martine has been presenting. And on our initial analysis, 22 of the 31 metrics are captured in our 60-measure dashboard. And I think this, for us, raises a couple of really important questions. I think, obviously the UK has that advantage, and I would strongly support the points that Martine raised about the need for international capacity building. You would very much hope that the UK could be in the position to have a strong head start in this area. But there is a very, very real question about how we address convergence and how we look to move towards the 31. Because one doesn't want to trade convergence against usability. We could simply take the 60 measures to 69 measures and add the missing 9. But we know already that this is a large and complex tool which is challenging for users to penetrate and understand what the narrative is. And so whether there is a need for us to consider whether we need to substitute out some of the existing metrics for some of the international metrics is a very classic statistical problem of having had a domestic consultation in 2023 where we had a very clear signal from UK users about what they felt was important against achieving this international consistency and lining up with the 31 measures. So we'll be working on that, I'm sure, over the next few months to try and reach a proposition that we will be sharing through our wellbeing publications. And so do please give us a little bit of time to think about that. Internationally, Martine has talked about the high-level expert group on Beyond GDP, and you probably would have noticed on the introductory slide that I'm labelled as co-chair of a second UN expert group, because why set up one when you can have two? Always a good approach. And our group, the group I look after and co-chair with Mohammed Hassan from the UAE, is a technical group that reports to the UN Statistics Commission, whereas, of course, the high-level expert group reported to the Office for the Secretary-General. Our work is far more on the technical basis of looking at the methodologies and the statistical frameworks and structures that need to sit around these data. And particularly one of the things that Martine flagged there was sort of the methodological work to support those 31 indicators. Obviously, having 17 of those emerging from the SDGs gives us a huge head start in that area. But there are a number of those metrics where I think there will need to be, and I'm sure Martine would agree, continued development of exactly what we mean by some of the concepts and measures there. But also how different countries engage with finding data to populate some of those variables. So life satisfaction, subjective well-being is obviously within the data set, the 31. We can use the Gallup World Report, but equally many countries such as the UK use domestic surveys, and so the high-level expert group report flags the need for us to look at which data sets are most appropriate to fill out this data to deliver that coherent international picture. I think one of the great challenges that we face here, and which everyone in this tradition has faced for a very long time, is very much this debate that Richard has just alluded to in terms of how we tell a story with limited and with financial constraints that allows us to deliver a product which is helpful in the policy terms that Sarah's just been describing. And I think you can see this if I draw an analogy with how the ONS publishes GDP. The GDP headline bulletin comes out and it gives you that lead indicator. But it doesn't give you in that one document a breakdown of gross fixed capital formation or GVA by industry by region or a disaggregation of household final consumption expenditure. They're all incredibly important numbers to understand how you've achieved that GDP number. But including them all in one bulletin or in one publication methodology is just too complex and makes for a very difficult narrative for users to understand. And in trying to look at where we are with well-being, and particularly some things when I start with a 60-measure dashboard, the question of whether we are trying almost too hard and presenting inputs, outputs, outcomes in a single framework rather than thinking about how we can disaggregate these to more clearly tell narratives that people can understand. So you can think about the health drivers of a health output, which may drive subjective well-being in the way that Richard's described it. Thinking about how we build a statistical system in this space is really what the international work that the technical group that I lead has been thinking about. Well-being is a very large topic. To expect to only communicate it via a high-level dashboard is hugely ambitious and challenging. And what we do need, I think, is to lean into the strengths of the wider statistical system and think about how we build bridges effectively between the depth of health data, education data, housing data, to explain what are the key drivers of these outcomes. Because ultimately a dashboard of the nature of the product that Martine has been describing has huge evaluative strength in helping us to think about how well government policy is improving people's lives. But when you only focus on the outcomes, it's very difficult to then think about which individual lever in the domain of health or housing is optimal to be pulled to achieve that. And I think that is an area that we increasingly see a need within the statistical system for us to be thinking more about these bridging tables between these different statistical domains and this ultimate high-level dashboard. And I think I would say it sounds like I'm talking about something that in a room of economic statisticians maybe is sort of veering off into social statistics, population statistics, and a whole range of other statistical landscapes. But I think it is important, and it's sort of my final point, to think about this as a whole, because there can be a tendency to think that the one statistical answer to all problems is, well, let's find a way of wedging it into the system of national accounts then. We know that GDP is hugely valuable for a range of economic purposes. And I think we've all agreed on this panel that there is a need for complementary data. But the development of that complementary data can happen in different parts of the statistical landscape, and giving a full validity to those and investing in those is going to be an important process. As Andre described this morning when he was talking about a new system of population and social statistics, that statistical standard that can have parity to the S&A, we can begin to create a wider landscape that is very much more supportive of this without placing new and additional burdens on the system of national accounts, which may not be the best vehicle for them.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. We have about 10 minutes left for questions or observations. And we've got some online questions as well, so let me have a little look at that. could you raise your hand if you want to make a point or ask a question? Questions I've got by text. What is the importance of the place of the Beyond GDP narrative in this age of populism and voter discontent? What are some specific examples, either at the international or UK level, of where GDP is currently being used, but Beyond GDP measures should be used instead? Who's leading on promoting the use of these indicators rather than just their construction? And in terms of the UN report, who's the most important audience for the report, do you think?
Well, the most. You want me to answer?
Yeah, well, those are four questions. Some or all of them, if you like.
As I said at the outset, the mandate for the group, of course, our group was tasked to provide measures. I mean, it was a measurement, right? But we went beyond measurement, saying, you know, if you going beyond GDP, you don't measure just for the sake of measuring. It's interesting. I mean, you play with numbers and so on, but it has, as both Richard and Sarah said, it has to be useful for policy and decision making. I would say not only for policymakers, but also for the public at large, to how they make decisions based and make governments accountable based on the information that they receive. So this mandate came out of the Pact for the Future, and it came from countries. Okay, so who is interested in this agenda? I hope that if we got this mandate, it's coming from the UN members. It's because countries are interested. And why countries are interested, I think, is because increasingly, and this linked to your first question, the first question, which is on populism, is that the sense that you can tell people, you can tell that the economy is going very well. We've seen growth everywhere in many countries, not everywhere, but in a number of countries. Despite that, you see that inequalities are rising, that the environment is not taken care of, that there are crises, that there was a COVID, that there are health crises, and so on. So there is a disconnect between what people feel and what their life is about, as opposed to some aggregate figures such as GDP. It's not accusing GDP there, it's a misuse of GDP that I'm accusing, because the policymakers were every quarter will say, oh, well, our country is doing well because growth has been 0.5 instead of 0, which I think, and so I think this is where the dissonance is coming from, and the populism maybe is coming from, is this disconnect what people value and they feel for their lives, and the stories that are being told by economic aggregates alone. Now, it should be fair that there are increasingly reports about inequalities in particular, income inequalities, and even, the national accountants would say, as Richard said, there's much more in the national accounts than just GDP. If you took the time, when I was still at the OECD, we produced both GDP, just not even looking at, we produced net adjusted disposable income, which is per capita, and GDP per capita, just using income. Why moving beyond GDP? GDP per capita is good, but I think you should look at net adjusted income, household income, which was one recommendation of the Stiglitz Commission, by the way. Take the household perspective, just looking at that. And so, there is this sort of, I don't know, GDP has become sort of the mantra, and I think that is creating a lot of dissatisfaction and disconnect.
Richard, do you have observation?
Yes, so someone asked, what is the use of a measure? The use of a measure should be to appraise what is the likely effect of a policy in terms of its impact on well-being, on the thing which is valued. So we've been working with encouragement from the Treasury on worked examples from the Green Book. Using the Green Book methodology, what does it suggest are highly cost-effective uses of public money and less cost effective. And of course there are some very cost effective uses of money. For example, on mental health, treatment of mental health probably pays for itself. That's what we find. Skills for non-graduates, apprenticeships, pay for themselves again over a longer period. Money spent on the police has a big effect on community well-being through lower crime. Roads and rail, on which a lot of money has been spent by the present government, have very low benefit cost ratios. I mean, this is the language through which everything should be debated, what we're talking about today.
Thank you, Richard. Sarah.
So I think maybe just picking up on the point particularly about populism and who tells and who holds the story of how things, I think it's why it feels so important that these data sets are regarded as common good, and that the work of people like the Statistics Authority really helps that to be recognised. Because if they are seen as being sitting within the ownership of individual governments, then the question of who owns the story and who tells the story, I think, is significantly compromised. So I absolutely would agree with Martine's hypothesis about what is driving much of populism, that gap between the story that people hear being told and what they feel their lived experience is, and that of the communities around them. And we need to, along with other things, we need to be using data sets that is to close that gap. And therefore the way in which that they are described, the role of different actors in the system to tell the story feels critically important.
And Richard.
On the international stage, the countries who are leading the international process, the Global Alliance, which Spain has been core to setting up and establishing, I think they very clearly see in this sort of question of GDP or beyond GDP numbers in the area of concessional finance for the Global South. I think this is an area that they're particularly interested in, and there's pressure. I think within the UK, there's clearly a multiplicity of characters and actors who are very excited about this. Sarah's presentation that showed the way the different nations of the country, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, have been thinking about this, showed that just a UK-level approach is not going to be adequate to meet the diverse needs of those communities. But I think also recognising that there is that multiplicity of governments who are going to be interested in this, it does take us back to the important issue of independence and making sure these data are produced independently, and where they are driven by public consultation, that they are actually representing the true voice of the whole population. I think that's also essential.
Which, if I may,
yes.
which makes the task even more complicated, because remember we had in our mandate to propose indicators that are universal but also country owned. So you would say, if you want to be as close as possible to the population's needs and lived experience, it will never be universal, right? I mean, and so the point here is that you need probably both, which is you need something universal, because you still want, for instance, for concessional finance, you need to have something which can be universal, because you want to be able to see whether you're going to, provide development assistance to Cambodia as opposed to a country in Africa, and so you need to have the same yardstick. At the same time, if you want to look at and it can be, beyond GDP per capita, because the country can, you want to give assistance, for instance, for an education program in Cambodia as opposed to a health program in Zimbabwe, for instance. So you need to have this, but it has to be consistent and universal. But at the same time, if you're too detached from the preoccupations of people in a particular country, then we back to the issue of, it will be the same problem as with GDP. So I think that the framework that we have to propose has to be high level for globally, for the sort of use at the global level, but you need to allow country to adjust this framework to their own needs and reflect their own population lived experience. Otherwise, I don't think it will work.
Thank you. Well, it just remains for me to thank all our speakers for fascinating presentations.
You've got a question at the
Oh, I think we're almost out of time, but we've probably got time for one question.
Thank you. So I'm Ritik from University of Leeds. First of all, very enlightening panel. I learned a lot today. I just had a few clarifications. Martine, you mentioned that in the new framework, one of the enablers is going to be good governance. So I see like this framework can be seen as a push to the good governance agenda, but in the literature, in the institutional economics literature, you see that the good governance agenda has had a devastating impact on many countries. So I was just wondering how the expert committee made peace with that. I had a clarification question with Lord Richard as well. You mentioned that you mentioned the exercise of monetizing one increase in life satisfaction, right? And I think it's roughly around £13,000. As I'm sure you're aware that people use different scales while reporting life satisfaction. So, obviously, a rich person is gonna have much higher monetized well-being of one scale than a poor person. And how does one account for that? Just one last clarification from Richard Hayes, where you mentioned that among the 6 indicators that you take into account, you mentioned both self-reported health and life satisfaction. Richard pointed out that life satisfaction includes the domain of health. So in a way, you are double counting health. And so in a way, you are putting more weight to health. And if there's any reason for that, thank you.
Okay, so we'll have quick responses.
Yeah,
to
very
that.
quickly.
So first on governance.
Yes, on governance. Yes, I mentioned governance because going back to the Brundtland report, that was a long time ago. Governance was when sustainable development was defined in the Brundtland report. It had actually 4 components. There was economic, environment, social, but there was also governance. The experts discussed at length how to, to reflect that into its work. And governance, we capture some of it into institutional capital and institutional quality in current well-being. But there are other aspects of good governance that we thought are part of the enablers, but those are many, as Richard said. We focused on outcomes, okay? So the dashboard is populated with indicators that are outcome indicators and neither inputs or outputs indicators. So in terms of the fact that we have enablers is just to remind ourselves that all this is not coming out of nothing, in particular a lot of policy levers, governance being one of these.
Thank you. I think the second point was about monetization and whether when you monetize, you don't overweight relatively well-off people.
Well, got a big question. So, let me tell you the ideal way of doing this. The ideal way is to measure the impact of whatever you're studying on people's well-being. So if the impact is through a change in incomes to people, we've got a very good function that relates changes in well-being to changes in income, which of course shows the diminishing marginal well-being value of income. So that takes into account, I think, what you have in mind. So that would be the ideal way of doing this. That if the change is an income change, you measure its impact on well-being through your information on who the income change is accruing to and what their level of income is. And you then do the same with everything else. And then if you insist on monetizing it, which I think policymakers are going to for the next 20 years, probably because that's the way they think. You have to be very clear what it means to say. So we've so far got the exercise has taken us to the combined change in well-being across the population. We've then got to find what is the monetary change which would produce that same change in well-being. So we have to make an assumption about who the monetary change is accruing to. If you assume that the monetary change is going to be proportional to the income of the across the population, so it's going to be £10 for somebody with £100 a week, and it's going to be £1 for somebody with £10 a week. If you make that assumption, then the rate at which you calculate the conversion of the total change in well-being into its monetary equivalent is the average income per head divided by the coefficient in the well-being equation when you regress well-being on log income.
Thank you. And Richard, in a sentence...
Am I double counting? Yes. Because we're not aggregating the 7 leading indicators, effectively they're still giving you those domain-based different perspectives. And I think essentially where we have life satisfaction, if you do view that as sort of the guiding star apex indicator, all the other 6 necessarily feed into it. But I think they are looking at self-reported physical health as well as subjective well-being. It is important to look at those because we're very aware that people in perfectly good physical health can suffer from depression or anxiety and other mental health conditions. And as Rich has indicated, that can be a very, very important component within our understanding of well-being. So being able to have just a little bit of focus in on that as an issue, particularly when 40% of government spending on services is on health, we felt it was commensurate to have a health indicator there of that type.
Right, well, thank you. Thank you. And yes, so thank you to all our speakers for fascinating presentations and engagement with the questions. Thank you for attending, and accept my apologies for appalling chairmanship resulting in an overrunning of about 10 minutes. So my apologies. Thank you for coming anyway.
Thank you.